My name is Sherry Heath. I wrote a paper on how to effectively manage a remote team. The reason I picked this topic is because in 2020, my team became a remote team suddenly, and I was given very little guidance on how to manage my team. I know that other people have faced this situation, which is why I feel that my paper and the guide that's included in it will be useful for managers who are in a similar situation. The purpose of this paper is this paper will help the hospitality industry by creating a best practice guide for managers in hospitality who lead remote teams. My paper and the guide that I created focused on 4 areas. These 4 areas are a general overview of remote teams, obstacles that remote teams face, things that successful remote teams do well, and the role technology plays on a remote team. Later on in this presentation, I will go into more detail in each of these areas. When preparing my literature review, I used over 30 resources. Some of the notable resources that I used were Cantan and Serban, who discussed employee motivation and gave 8 reasons why employees may lack motivation and what you can do as a manager to help them with motivation. Another resource I used was Zaleski, who spoke about communication and things you can do to ensure communication is strong on your remote team. Another resource I used was PerkBox. PerkBox gave 20 examples of things that you can do to help your remote team with team building. Another resource I used was Fifth Third Bank, which discussed different types of technology that remote teams use. Lastly, Forbes Council members, which gave ideas of what to do when technology fails. The conclusion of the literature review was I created a guide. The guide is for 2 groups of people. The first is managers who are new to managing a remote team. The second is managers who have experience leading a remote team, but maybe need some help improving in some areas. After completing the literature review, I created a guide for managers. The guide includes things such as what are remote teams? Remote teams are teams that do not work in the same location. What size are most remote teams? Remote teams actually vary in size from just a couple people to excess of 100 people. I also covered what makes managing a remote team different than an in-person team. This is the fact that you are not in the same location as your employees. Due to that, you're going to have different obstacles, there's going to be different things that make your team successful, and you're going to have a heavy reliance on technology. All of these things will be discussed later in this presentation. Remote teams face many obstacles that their in-person counterparts do not. For this reason, the second section of the guide focuses on these obstacles. During my research, I identified 4 areas that were common to remote teams. These are feeling isolated, lack of motivation, employee burnout, and declining productivity. As a manager, if you identify your employees feel isolated, there are several things you can do. You can pair employees together, or you can have formal or informal check-ins with your employees. If you identify your employees are lacking motivation, you need to determine why. In my guide, I give 8 reasons that employees are lacking motivation. A couple of these are the employee does not have the required skills, in which case you can help the employee to develop the skills, or the job isn't challenging enough for the employee, in which case you can help make the job more challenging by having the employee train another employee, or you can make small changes to the job. The third obstacle that I came across was employee burnout. If you identify your employees are experiencing burnout, you can give your employees social support, which is helping them find the resources available to them. Also, you can job craft, which is making small changes to the job that help the employee so that they don't feel burnt out. The last obstacle that's common to remote teams is declining productivity. When you identify declined productivity on your team, you need to first determine what the current culture is, and then determine what you want the culture to look like. At this point, you can begin to make changes slowly to ensure that your team's productivity increases. As remote teams face many challenges that are unique to them, they also have things that make them successful that are unique to them. For this reason, the third section of my guide will focus on the areas that I identified that help remote teams to be successful. This is communication, training existing employees, training new employees, advancement opportunities, and team building, but team building will be discussed on the next slide. Communication is very important to remote teams, and there's many ways that managers can ensure that communication happens on their remote team. They can schedule regular check-ins with their employees, or they can craft a newsletter to help employees get to know what's going on with other employees. Secondly, training existing employees is extremely important. Managers can do this in many ways. They can develop lunch and learn sessions where employees get together and learn at the same time. They can create buddy systems where employees are learning at the same time. They can streamline learning. In my guide, I give several examples of how this can be done. Next, managers should focus on training new employees. All of the things that are done with training existing employees should be done with new employees, but a couple of things should be added, which are focus on the integration and social component of onboarding, expect a more extended timeline for employee training for new employees, and remember that onboarding is a continuous journey, and it should be done throughout the employee's employment with the company. The last thing that I discuss is advancement opportunities. Advancement opportunities are very important to remote teams, and often employees that work remotely get overlooked. As a manager, you need to ensure this doesn't happen to your team. You can do this in several ways. One way is you can promote the individual and team accomplishments. Another thing is you can signal management accessibility by being available to your teams. And lastly, you can develop best practices and let other people know what your team members are doing well. Continuing with successful remote teams, I want to discuss team building. Team building is very important on remote teams, and oftentimes it's overlooked because it's more difficult when your team works remotely. In the guide, I gave 20 examples of what you can do as a manager to help your team build. Right now, I'm going to point out just a couple of them that you can do. One of them that I really like is you can have your employees take a personality quiz and then discuss the results. This helps you learn how your employees best like to communicate. Another thing that you can do is you can have your team members send daily snapshots of random things. This helps the team members get to know each other in a kind of an informal format. Last, you can do a trash pickup challenge. Not only does this help the environment because you go to a park and you pick up trash, but it also creates a fun competition with your team members. The fourth and final section of my guide is on technology. Technology is extremely important to remote teams. Almost everything remote teams do is done on technology. Therefore, I discussed several types of technology that remote teams used. The first one is remote teams use a lot of instant messaging technology or real-time messaging technology. This is where you send a message and the person gets it in real time. Many times this is used to ask questions, to get answers, or just to communicate with your teammates. Another type of technology that's used is video conferencing software. This is similar to instant messaging technology, except for you have a live video of the person that you're talking to. Another type of technology is document storage and file sharing. This is similar to a Google Drive or a Dropbox, where you can share documents with other employees, and you can also save those documents in a safe and secure manner. Another type is project management tools. These are used to manage various aspects of the project that you're working on. Another thing that a lot of remote teams use is collaboration tools. Collaboration tools combine the first four tools that I just discussed into one tool, which makes it much easier for employees to only learn one system and everything is in one spot. Another type of technology that remote teams use is digital HR tools. Digital HR tools do pretty much everything that an in-person HR department does, except for they do it digitally. Lastly, are scheduling tools, which can be used for schedules and requesting time off, and so employees can see what they're working. Continuing with technology, both the manager and employee need to know what to do when technology fails, as this happens all the time. First, the manager should try to work as a liaison between the IT department and the employee to help the employee get the issue resolved as quickly as possible. Also, the manager should know how to guide the employee and what the employee should do. In my guide, I give 16 examples of what to do when technology fails. Right now I'm going to cover just a couple of those examples. The first one is employees should stay calm and research the issue. It seems obvious, but a lot of times the issue can be resolved using Google to search for it or watching a YouTube video. Another thing is to reboot your computer. We always hear this, but there is a reason that IT tells us to do this, and that's because when we work remotely, we often don't shut down our computers, which causes them to slow down, and often shutting them down is the key. Another thing is to check your internet speed. I gave a website called fast.com where you can do this for free. Lastly, you should remember that technology has limitations, and you should always just try to stay calm and research the answer. Although I tried to cover as much as I could in this guide, the guide does have some limitations. The first limitation is I couldn't cover every situation that a manager could possibly face. There may need to be more research in the future on situations that come up that were not covered in this guide. Secondly, my guide focused on small teams. As I currently manage a small team, that's why I decided to do small teams versus large teams. Lastly, the guide has suggestions, but the suggestions may not work in every situation. If you find that what was suggested does not work, then there are multiple suggestions that you can try until you find one that does work. This guide focused on 4 areas that I found to be very important when managing a remote team. These areas are general overview of remote teams, obstacles remote teams face, things successful remote teams do well, and the role technology plays on a remote team. This guide is designed to fill in a knowledge gap for managers who are new to leading a remote team or managers who need more guidance on their current remote teams. Thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I hope that you will enjoy my paper.